How's it going, everybody? Looks like I'm live. Just waiting for the system to kick into gear here, and we can get started. Good. Things are moving forward now. I'm live. Interesting topic this week. To start off, I always like to kind of understand where everyone is coming from, understand how your week has been, and just check in, because that's kind of what this Sunday morning ritual for me now has become. It's really a check-in, to really yeah, I'm talking a lot, but I'm really trying to listen too. I want to hear what people have to say. I want you to comment. Maybe at some point, this isn't just me talking, but it can become a variety of people talking within this space. Maybe it needs to be a different platform. Facebook Live is good. That's where there are big audiences, at least for me. But maybe there's a way to expand this a bit if people are interested and want to talk about ways to collaborate. But this week, I wanted to talk a bit about cross cultural communication and cross cultural issues. Um, I find that as I think about topics, they come to me um, through whatever circumstances may arise, and I want to kind of honor those impulses, that serendipity. Serendipity is important. It seems like it's by accident, but a lot of things probably have to do with something becoming serendipitous for you to even be in a position for that sort of thing to happen. Takes a certain mindset. But probably, as many of you know, I have a lot of background with China and Chinese culture. Um, when I graduated from college in the early 90s, I had a degree in English literature, and I was kind of trying to find my path. And it was something that I thought deeply about. I didn't take lightly. I ended up wanting to try my hand at teaching. So I went to China, and I went to China in 1992. And I did that because it seemed like if I was going to teach English overseas, at that time, China was the place to do it. So I wanted to kind of experience firsthand what that culture was like for me. And it became, you know, I met my wife there. I taught for a little over 2 years. It became my life passion, understanding Chinese culture, and trying to understand the really inscrutable nature of how that culture operates, and ultimately how it contrasts with Western culture, individualist culture versus kind of collectivist Confucian culture. Um, it's a very interesting topic to consider, and I think it's becoming more and more important that we understand the cultural differences between these two. I'm going to call them ways of thinking, ways of living, ways of interacting, because they're based on very different foundations. Um, and I experienced it firsthand. When I went to China, um, culture shock was a thing. I kind of put a question in the space for this live stream about culture shock. I've never heard anyone talk about that over the last 10 years or 20 years. Is culture shock gone? It can't be. I think if you go to a new culture and you immerse yourself in it, at some point you're going to experience a certain sort of shock from it. I'm diverging a little bit here, but think about that. Where did that term go? Why do we no longer talk about it? Is it because of how connected we are now? Um, I don't know. Something worth thinking about. But ultimately, teaching English in 1992, just a couple years after quite a bit of disruption in China with Tiananmen Square and the issues going on there, I was able to gain a lot of insight and kind of delve into the deeper meaning of China and Confucianism and how cultures worked and how things interacted. In China, there's something called guanxi, guanxi is a term for relationships. But I think they're really misunderstood in the West. You know, in the West, when you hear about guanxi, you think, oh, that is, code for corruption or, backdoor type stuff. But it isn't. It really isn't. And when I was getting my graduate degree in communications at Grand Valley, I went deep on cross cultural issues. I really wanted to understand communications in China versus communications here in the West. And so I wrote this paper in my systems theory course looking at network communication systems theory, and how that applies to the concept of guanxi and the Confucian tradition in China. That's essentially the title of the paper. Because what happens when these cultures collide, there are set rules in China for how you interact. And when those rules get transferred into a Western thinking individualist nation, the rules can get crossed up, and it can lead to complications, complexity that you need to be able to kind of work your way through and think through why people react the way they react, why when you kind of cross over and collide these communication theories, you end up in some cases, a whole heap of hurt. And you might end up damaging relationships for good. They might never come back. So I experienced a lot when I lived there because, I was in my mid 20s. I was, open to understanding new things and kind of looking at how things might work in this culture that, again, was very inscrutable. Maybe we understand it a bit more now. We tend to look at it as monolithic, as a communist country. Man, China is, yeah, there's a communist government, but it is a hyper capitalist country with an authoritarian leadership. They do capitalism like no one's business. They just happen to have complete control over it. There's surveillance, there's all sorts of stuff going on. Maybe that's for another discussion down the road. But getting back to this kind of cross-cultural issue, if you look at network systems theory and you understand how networks work, guanxi networks fit into that kind of concept. And Confucianism does as well. So what I tried to do in my graduate degree was kind of understand how systems theory applied, as I said, and network systems theory in particular, to this idea. And really, when you think about a system, you can analyze everything. I mean, you have to be able to narrow your focus. You can try and look at the system of the universe, but you're not going to glean a whole lot from it because without narrowing your target to really look at a causal loop or how a system works, you're not going to gain any insight from it. So I was trying to really analyze these communication networks. I'm rambling. I'm trying not to ramble here. What I understood is that when I did a deeper dive on Confucianism, I understood that there's something called, Confucius lived in 5th century BC. And, he was kind of, from my understanding, the first instance of the Golden Rule came from Confucius in one of his understandings of this. And what he was trying to do back then was create order in a chaotic society during that time. And I'm looking up at my notes here a little bit if I'm looking off screen, just kind of reviewing the paper I wrote. But one thing that came out of this, and he wanted to build a hierarchy of relationships. And the concept and this devotion to filial piety in China, ancestor worship, became the foundation of what Confucianism is based on. But ultimately, Confucius determined that there were 5 cardinal relationships. And the relationships were like this: father son was number 1, ruler subject number 2, husband wife, older brother younger brother, and friend friend. Is how that kind of lays out in this hierarchical order. Um, so you can kind of communicate upward or downward in this system, um, and the relationships that you build really start with the family, and they actually start around the dinner table. What happens in that communal Chinese meal? Uh, at first glance, seems like there's not much going on there, but the round table, the way that everyone interacts, the ceremony of eating, when the toast is done, is all about paying respect to other people, and helping them validate their identities. Um, but when you think about this kind of relationship strata in society, that plays out everywhere, and it determines your circles of relationships. Obviously, the family is at the core, then the ruler, uh, then friends, acquaintances, and so on. The same way that we have kind of relationship boundaries in our lives, and some people will be in that inner circle, others are right outside of it, and that circle expands. And that's kind of how our relationships come into play. But, you know, um, this stuff is what became guanxi. And guanxi is the type of thing that if you have it and you build it, and you do have to build it, um, you can be part of the in group. If you don't build guanxi and you don't have guanxi, you're kind of an outsider, and you're not going to have the same kind of opportunities in the culture and in the society that you would otherwise. Um, so when I was teaching, I just noticed there was a very strong bond between my students, stronger than I had seen in the West. That the way that my students were connecting was incredibly important, because they knew that not only were they going to be close friends, but they were going to be helping each other out throughout life. This is all about reciprocity. When you have a guanxi relationship, it can't get out of balance. It's got to stay in balance. But it manifests itself in a very interesting way. Um, Guanxi is kind of like a friend of a friend can help a friend out. Um, how those networks are formed is very interesting and complex. I just remember, building those relationships with my students, watching them connect, knowing that this stuff was going to be impacting them for the rest of their life. And I, because I met my wife, I was a guest on her radio show, and we got married, I was able to kind of benefit from her guanxi and her relationships. For instance, we took a trip once to Putoshan, near Ningbo in Zhejiang province. And a friend of ours made arrangements for us. So she talked to a friend of hers and told her friend to take care of us when we visited the island. And we had never been there, we didn't know anyone. And when we got there, her friend picked us up and looked after us for the whole weekend. Took us to dinner, took us wherever we needed to go, and built this, helped us just because. And it's likely because he was, I don't want to say indebted, but he was obligated to our friend who probably had helped him in a similar situation of some sort. So this idea of an indebtedness, it's called renqing. Um, when you build guanxi and you use the guanxi relationship, it's all about this reciprocity. It can't get out of balance. If someone goes to the bank too much and uses too much, people are going to lose face. Bad things are going to happen. Um, that's why, here's the thing. So another example, when I was teaching, I had to be careful about gifts. If someone came to my door, and often this would happen, a professor might come and bring me a gift. And I had to be careful because if I accepted that gift, they were going to come back and ask me a favor. So I knew if I accepted the gift, likely what was going to happen, they would circle back with me in the near future, often asking me to review and edit their dissertation or their paper or their work that they were working on and translating to English. I didn't mind doing that, especially as a newer teacher, English teacher in China. I had to build some of those relationships. So I started to build connections with some of the other teachers. And it was kind of this idea of renqing. I became indebted because they gave me the gift, so I got to pay them back. That's all right. It's not corruption. It's not a bad thing. It's a system on how things can work. So this paper I wrote during graduate school, I actually was lucky enough to bring it to a intercultural communications conference at Ohio University back in like 2005, and I got to present it. And I was freaked out. I wasn't fully confident. I was just a lowly master's student with all of these PhD profs and kind of experts in their field. But what I didn't know at the time was I was onto something. And when I presented and kind of talked through my paper, someone in the audience pointed out something really important to me. If guanxi becomes corrupt, it's no longer guanxi. It's guanxi because it maintains this ethical balance and it helps others and it keeps things connected. So just an interesting point, and that made me think, right, we can't look at this as a pejorative in the West, that guanxi is bad. It's not bad. It's how Chinese culture works. It is something that, as Westerners, we need to understand. China, Japan, Confucian cultures, collectivist cultures, they're typically a high context culture, according to Edward T. Hall, versus a low context culture. Now, an individualist culture, a Protestant type based culture, it's usually lower context. And every country is different, and it's typically one or the other. It's not that one is better or worse than the other, they're just different. But basically, high context often means there's a lot that's implied. The idea of losing face and being made to look bad in a situation, that is devastating. You never do that. You never put someone in a Confucian culture in a situation where they might lose face. That is a taboo. Whereas in the West, we try to make people lose face on social media all the time. It's always bam, bam, bam. That happens in China too. But again, these cultures are merging. And it's been 15, 20 years since I wrote this paper, and man, almost going on 30 years since I experienced it for the first time, firsthand. So I guess what I'm getting at is that high context and low context, you don't know what's going on. No in China doesn't always mean no. Maybe no 3 times means yes. And you might not understand why people are kind of remaining silent or operating the way they're operating, but they're doing it because they're thinking of the collective and how they're going to fit into the culture, how they might need to build guanxi, how they might need to exist in their cultural circumstance. Whereas in a low context culture, it's very explicit. I say what I mean. This is what I mean. Take it or leave it. Not take it or leave it per se, but we we don't kind of get into this implied type approach to things. That's why it can be very tricky when you're navigating between a high context and a low context culture. They are fundamentally different, but they clash constantly, and it plays out in how people communicate. So, as I was working on this paper, I became a big fan of Edward T. Hall. And he's an anthropologist that wrote this book called Beyond Culture. And there are a couple chapters in there about cultural contexts. Chapter 7, for one, contexts, high and low, is a chapter I highly recommend to you. That whole book I would recommend to you if you're interested in understanding how cultures collide, how we misunderstand each other. The book was written in the 70s. I think it was like the first book that the Google Library Project digitized. I may be wrong on that. That's what I heard. You know, back in the day, back in the 2000s when that was a thing. It doesn't seem like a big deal now. Nevertheless, here was a guy who grew up in the early to mid 20th century. He spent a lot of time in the southwestern United States. And during that time, he was basically going there as a government bureaucrat, working with the local cultures. And he became fascinated and he was embedded with Navajo, Hopi, Latino, Mexican, and then the government culture, the bureaucratic culture. And he studied all those cultures. And he has this great autobiography, a couple autobiographies that he's done, just talking about that whole milieu of interaction and how the rules were different for every culture. Ultimately, he started writing these books and he wrote Beyond Culture. He kind of came up with a method, this high context, low context approach, to really understand how we need to interact with things. I've got chapter 7 open right here on my desktop. You can actually find the whole book online and download a PDF. But he really, in this chapter, I mean, I didn't reread. I read it probably a year ago. I would have to read it again to really give you my full take on the anecdotes and the stories he tells in this chapter. But okay, here's a section. In high context systems, people and places of authority are personally and truly, not just in theory, responsible for the actions of subordinates down to the lowest man. In low context systems, responsibility is diffused throughout the system and difficult to pin down, a point that President Nixon exploited in his Watergate defense. Paradoxically, when something happens to a low context system, everyone runs for cover, and the system is supposed to protect its members. If a scapegoat is needed, the most plausible low-ranking scapegoat is chosen. In the My Lai incident back in Vietnam, a lieutenant took the rap. So I'm glad I found that little section because it kind of speaks to high context and low context. And the hierarchy in a country like China, in a Confucian culture, versus this low context system and I guess this diffusion throughout the system. I guess that's why leaders don't always take responsibility for their actions. They behave in such a way that they pass the buck. Sorry, I just got a little chat there. So it becomes, you know, it's a nice method system to look at our current culture. Is there anything else? Yes, thank you, Kent. You found it. That's exactly it. I highly recommend that. I recommend his other books as well. You can learn a lot, you know, in these times, in 2020, and in the 2020s, we're actually saying that. We have a decade ahead of us called the 2020s. Who are we? What are we going to be? How are we going to cooperate with other cultures? How do these cultures fit together? We can't be siloed. We can't build a metaphorical wall. It's not going to work. China tried that with the Great Wall, trying to keep people out, but instead it kept them in. That's not good. I'm not for kind of the unequal free for all of globalism, but globalization fairly distributed should be more resilient. It should be the type of thing that helps people. Um, that may be what we need to get to. This post pandemic world in the 2020s is going to be reshaped very differently. We have to learn the lessons of different cultures. We have to understand what is the mindset? How are people thinking in a particular culture? And what is driving them to behave the way they do? I mean, start there. Not to mention, you start adding in trauma and all the other stuff going on that affects people mentally and their mental health. But just starting to understand how a culture thinks. And here in the U.S., I mean, we're a melting pot, right? I mean, what does that mean? Are we a melting pot or are we a salad? A melting pot, we should all be melting together. A salad, we're all mixed up, but we maintain our identities. I don't know. It's complicated. But understand that people across town may have a completely different culture from yours. And they may be bringing their culture into a space where it's got to mix with a lot of other cultures. And that's kind of what I saw. How guanxi would get applied in the US under different rules. And I didn't know how to respond other than, okay, back away. This isn't working because the systems have crossed. Wow, I'm at 27 minutes. Any thoughts? I don't like to go much longer than a half hour. I can if you guys want me to keep talking, but I would encourage you to look into Edward T. Hall, to think about the 5 cardinal relationships of Confucianism and how Confucianism and collectivism affects the thinking of people who live in a particular country that follows those rules. I think it's a great place to start in understanding what our future might become. Yeah, going deep. So, next week, I'm trying to think about a topic for next week. Do you guys like this? Are you happy with it? Are you learning things? Ask me questions. Maybe we have a forum and have discussions. I've been doing that a lot. During these times, I've been looking for salons and groups like Creative Mornings, different things, Y International Group. We talk about a lot of stuff. This is a time to lean in to the positive connections of technology, to connect with people through these mediums, through these channels. Don't disconnect now. You can't necessarily have the face-to-face physical connection as much, but you can have the face-to-face digital connection, and that is incredibly important. Okay, I think on that note, I'm going to wrap. I don't want to go much longer than this. This is fun. I love talking about this stuff. I think deeply about it. I consider myself bicultural, or at least I have a bicultural brain, so I'm thinking across high context and low context. I'm thinking about collectivism and individualism and how all these things come together. I encourage you to put yourself in the cultural shoes of another person and try to see things through their eyes and understand how their worldview is shaped because of what they've experienced. Everyone's different. We all have different influences. We need to appreciate where other people are coming from so that we can help them, so that we can have empathy for them, so that we can make stronger connections. Kent Sinclair dropped Beyond Culture into the comments. If you're interested in the book, I highly recommend it. If you want to go deeper on that book, let me know. I'd love to have a further discussion with you about it. So I'm at 30 minutes. I'm going to sign out. Have an awesome day, everyone. I'll be back next week at 9 a.m. Ciao.